The cornfield was everything to my father. He would wake before dawn every day, his boots crunching on the gravel path as he stepped outside, coffee in one hand and a clipboard in the other. He'd stand at the edge of the field, looking out at the endless rows of golden stalks, mumbling things like, "Good yield this year," or "Storms could ruin it if we're not careful, doll." He treated that field like a member of the family, maybe even more than that. For us kids, the field was just there. It wasn't magical or special, it was background noise. We didn't think twice about it, except for how easy it was to get lost in. Dad made it clear from the time we were old enough to run that the field was off limits. "You go in there without me," he warned once, "and you might not come back." That was just Dad being Dad, though. He had a flair for the dramatic. Mom used to laugh about it when we were younger. "Your father and his ghost stories," she'd say, rolling her eyes. "Don't take it too seriously. The man watched too many scary movies as a kid, still the rules stuck, and we never went in." The farmhouse, on the other hand, was our kingdom. A sprawling, two-story building with faded white paint and green shutters, it sat perched on a slight hill overlooking the field. It wasn't fancy, but it was ours. The porch creaked in the wind, and the screen door had a habit of slamming shut, no matter how carefully you closed it. The air always smelled faintly of fresh, cut hay and damp earth. Inside, the house was alive with noise. Ethan, 13 and permanently glued to his tablet, liked to argue with Emma and Sarah about whose turn it was to play on the TV. Mom would shuffle between the kitchen and the laundry room, humming to herself as she went. Dad's deep voice would boom from his office, talking to someone on the phone about crop yields or market prices. And me, 16-year-old Mira, the designated babysitter and unofficial referee. I was the one who made sure Emma and Sarah didn't kill each other over dolls or crayons. The one who dragged Ethan away from his screen long enough to eat. The one who did her homework at the kitchen table while Mom quizzed me about boys and Dad rambled about corn. It was normal, boring even, but I liked it. At least, I did before the Sunday everything changed. That morning started out like any other. I woke up to the sound of Emma and Sarah arguing in the hallway. "You took my hairbrush?" I groaned, pulling the pillow over my head. "Would you two shut up? It's too early for this." By the time I made it downstairs, Dad was already halfway through his coffee, flipping through the newspaper like a man from another century. Ethan sat at the table with his tablet, the glow from the screen making his pale face look ghostly. Mom stood at the counter, frying bacon and humming some old tune I didn't recognize. "Morning, sunshine," Dad said when he saw me. I mumbled something that might have been "good morning" and poured myself a cup of coffee. The day seemed normal until Mom found the cockroaches. It started with a soft gasp. I looked up from my mug just in time to see her crouch down by the kitchen sink. She pulled open the cabinet and peered inside, her face scrunching in disgust. "Greg," she called to Dad, "come look at this." Dad stood and walked over, setting his coffee down on the counter. "What is it?" "Cockroaches," Mom said, her voice low. "A whole nest of them." Dad crouched down beside her, muttering something under his breath. I couldn't hear what he said, but the tension in his shoulders made my stomach twist. An hour later, a guy from the pest control agency showed up. He was a wiry man with a clipboard and a look of grim determination, like he was gearing up for battle. He poked around the house for a while before announcing that the infestation was worse than we thought. "We'll need to do a deep cleaning," he said, looking at Dad. "Nobody should be inside during the process. It's not safe." "Great," Dad muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. The plan was simple. We'd stay outside for a couple of hours while the pest control guy did his thing. It wasn't ideal, but it wasn't the end of the world either. Dad walked us kids out to the field while Mom stayed behind to go over paperwork with the pest control guy. The sun was high in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground. The corn swayed gently in the breeze, the stalks whispering secrets to one another. "Stay near the edge of the field," Dad said, his voice unusually firm. "And don't go in, not even a step." Emma giggled. Why not?" Dad's eyes flicked to her, then to me. Just don't. There was something in his tone that made me pause. It wasn't his usual overprotective dad act, it was nervous. Would we go in there? Ethan asked, smirking. It's just corn. It's not just corn, Dad said, his voice low. And if you see anyone out there, anyone at all, don't follow them. Come straight to me. The twins laughed, thinking it was one of his stories. I didn't laugh. The kids started playing near a pile of sand, building lopsided castles and throwing clumps of dirt at each other. Ethan sat on a rock, fiddling with his tablet. I plopped down on the grass with my phone, scrolling through Instagram and trying to ignore the knot in my stomach. Then the wind came. It swept through the field, bending the corn in waves that rippled like liquid gold. The kids stopped what they were doing and stared. Even Ethan looked up, his mouth slightly open. For a moment, I forgot to breathe. The field looked alive, but something ruined the view. In the middle of the field, there was a scarecrow. I blinked, confused. We didn't have a scarecrow. I would have known if we did. I'd have seen it before now. It was tall, with outstretched arms and a head that lolled to one side. From where I sat, I couldn't make out its face, but I didn't want to. Something about it made my skin crawl. Mira, Sarah called. What's that? I don't know, I said. I turned back to my phone, trying to shake the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. But when I looked again, the scarecrow was gone, not fallen over, not hidden by the wind, gone. I didn't have long to dwell on it. Mira, Dad's voice roared from the house. I turned just in time to see Emma at the edge of the field, struggling against a boy. He looked thin, almost skeletal, with torn clothes and pale, dirt-streaked skin. His hand gripped Emma's wrist, pulling her toward the corn. I jumped to my feet, my heart pounding. Emma! Stop! She turned her eyes wide with terror. Mira, help. She vanished into the corn. I froze. The boy was gone. The corn stood still as if nothing had happened. Behind me, Ethan's voice shook. Where's Emma? I couldn't answer. I just stared at the corn, waiting for it to move. It didn't, but I thought I heard something, faint and distant, like a whisper carried on the wind. A child's voice, calling my name. They told me not to blame myself. But how could I not? The days after Emma disappeared were a blur. The cops came first with their flashlights and notebooks, asking the same questions over and over. Where did you last see her? Did you notice anything unusual? Could she have wandered off? No one believed us about the boy, not even Dad, who had seen the terror on my face when I told him. A boy in the field, the sheriff asked, raising a skeptical eyebrow. Yes, I insisted. He pulled her into the corn. He was there. The sheriff sighed, scribbling something in his notepad. We'll do our best to find her. That was it. That was all they had, their best. The search parties came next, coming through the cornfield with dogs and drones and heat, sensing equipment. I watched from the porch as they moved through the rows, their voices muffled by the stalks. Mom stayed inside, pacing the kitchen with her phone pressed to her ear. Ethan sat on the steps, his head in his hands. Dad stood at the edge of the field, staring into it like he was waiting for it to spit Emma back out. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stood there, his face pale and his fists clenched at his sides. And me, I couldn't stop hearing her voice. Mira, help. The field was quiet at night. Too quiet. I lay awake in my bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house creak and settle around me. Every now and then, I thought I heard something, soft footsteps outside my window, or the faint rustle of corn. But when I looked, there was nothing. Just the wind. I barely slept. 2 days after Emma disappeared, Mom and Dad sat us down in the living room. We're going to keep looking, Mom said, her voice tight. Her eyes were red and puffy, like she hadn't slept in days. But for now, we have to stay strong. We have to stick together. What if she's gone forever? Sarah asked, her voice trembling. She's not, Dad said firmly. We'll find her. But his words were meant to be comforting, but his face said otherwise. He looked haunted. Mira, he said, turning to me. You're sure you saw someone in the field, a boy? Yes, I said, my voice cracking. He was pulling her. I swear, Dad didn't say anything for a long time. He just stared at me, his eyes dark and unreadable. Finally, he nodded. "I need to tell you all something," he said. Mom shot him a sharp look. "Gregor, they need to know." "Camilla," Dad said. "Especially Mira." "What are you talking about?" I asked. Dad took a deep breath, his hands gripping his knees. "When I was a kid, I had a friend named Sam. He was my best friend, practically my brother. One summer, when I was about 10, Sam and I were playing near the field. We weren't supposed to go in, but you know how kids are." I nodded, my stomach tightening. "One day, Sam dared me to go into the field with him," Dad continued. "We didn't go far, just a few rows in, but the deeper we went, the quieter it got. I don't know how to explain it, but it was like the air changed. It felt wrong." He paused, running a hand through his hair. "Then we heard something," he said. "A voice. It sounded like my mom, calling my name. Sam heard it too. He thought it was his mom. We started arguing about who it was, and then Sam ran toward the sound." "What happened?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dad swallowed hard. "I never saw him again. After that, the field became a prison. None of us were allowed to go near it, not even to play. Dad spent every waking moment watching it, as if expecting it to reveal its secrets. The search parties dwindled, and the cops stopped coming by. But the field didn't stop. It started with little things. At night, I'd hear soft knocking at my window. I'd look outside, but no one would be there. Then there were the whispers, faint and distant, carried on the wind. Sometimes it was my name. Sometimes it was Emma's voice, crying for help. One night, I woke up to the sound of scratching. It was coming from the walls, slow and deliberate, like someone dragging their nails along the wood. I froze, my heart racing. "Mira?" A voice whispered. I sat up in bed, clutching my blanket. "Who's there?" The scratching stopped. 2 weeks passed. 2 weeks of guilt, of fear, of hearing Emma's voice in my head every time I closed my eyes. I couldn't take it anymore. Then, one night, she came back. It was late, past midnight, when I heard the knock at the front door. At first, I thought I'd imagined it, but then it came again, louder this time. I crept downstairs, my heart pounding. Mom and Dad's bedroom door was shut, and the rest of the house was silent. When I opened the door, I almost screamed. It was Emma. She stood on the porch, barefoot and shivering, her hair tangled and her dress torn. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and unblinking. "Emma," I whispered. She didn't answer. I threw my arms around her, pulling her inside. "Mom, Dad, she's back." The sound of footsteps filled the house as my parents and siblings came rushing down the stairs. Mom let out a choked sob, pulling Emma into her arms. "Where were you?" Dad demanded, his voice shaking. "What happened?" Emma didn't say a word. She just stared at him, her expression blank. Something was wrong. She looked like Emma. She sounded like Emma. But when I looked into her eyes, I felt a chill run down my spine. They were empty. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. The way she stared at Dad, like she didn't recognize him. The way she didn't flinch when Mom cried into her shoulder. And then there was the scarecrow. I hadn't told anyone about it, not even Dad. But as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about it. It had been there, in the field, just before Emma disappeared. And now she was back. But was it really her? Emma wasn't Emma. I couldn't prove it. Not yet. But every time I looked at her, every time she spoke, that cold knot in my stomach tightened. She acted like Emma. She laughed at Sarah's silly jokes and asked Ethan about his video games. Mom cried every time she saw her and Dad. Well, Dad just watched her, his eyes narrowing every time she did something a little too perfect, a little too calculated. But at night, when the house grew quiet, I swore I could hear her whispering. Not to herself, to something else. Life was supposed to go back to normal. That's what Mom kept saying. "It's a miracle," she told me one morning as we washed dishes together. Her hands trembled as she scrubbed a plate, and her voice wavered with the kind of desperate hope that made my heart ache. "We should be grateful. You should be grateful." "I am." I lied. She didn't notice the way I glanced over my shoulder, checking to see if Emma was watching us. Emma's return didn't erase the nightmares. If anything, they got worse. The field haunted me. Every dream started the same way. I'd be standing at the edge of the corn, the sun setting behind me, casting long, jagged shadows across the ground. The stalks would sway. whispering secrets I couldn't understand. And then I'd see her, Emma, or something that looked like her, standing in the middle of the field. Her hair hung limp around her face, her dress torn and dirty. She'd raise a hand, beckoning me forward. "Nira," she'd call. Her voice would echo, soft and distorted, like it wasn't coming from her mouth but from the field itself. "Help me." I'd take a step toward her, then another. The corn would close in around me, the whispers growing louder, almost deafening. And then I'd see it. The scarecrow, it loomed over me, its stitched mouth curling into a grin, its button eyes glinting in the dying light. Its arms stretched wide, fingers made of broken branches reaching for me. I'd wake up sweating, my heart racing, the echo of Emma's voice still ringing in my ears. It wasn't just the dreams. Strange things started happening around the house. One night, I heard the knocking again. Soft, deliberate taps on my window. I rolled over in bed, pulling the blanket over my head. "It's just the wind," I whispered to myself. The knocking grew louder. "Mira," a voice called. I froze. "Myra, please, let me in." It was Emma's voice. But Emma was asleep in her room. I stayed under the covers, squeezing my eyes shut until the knocking stopped. The next morning, I found something on the porch, a doll. It was old and worn, its fabric face stained with dirt, its button eyes mismatched. Its smile was stitched too wide, the thread fraying at the corners. I stared at it, my stomach twisting. "What's that?" Ethan asked, peeking over my shoulder. "Nothing," I said, kicking the doll off the porch and into the dirt. But when I glanced at the cornfield, I swore I saw something move. Emma grew stranger by the day. She never talked about what happened to her. When Mom or Dad asked, she'd shrug and say she didn't remember. She didn't flinch at loud noises or cry when Sarah accidentally broke her favorite doll. She didn't seem afraid of anything. One night, I found her sitting on the floor in the hallway, staring at the wall. "Emma," I whispered. She didn't respond. I stepped closer, my bare feet cold against the wooden floor. "What are you doing?" She turned to look at me, her head tilting to one side like a curious bird. Her eyes glinted in the dim light, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of movement behind them, like shadows shifting just out of sight. "Listening," she said. "For what?" She smiled, her teeth too white, too perfect. "The field." Dad wasn't blind to it. I found him sitting on the porch one evening, staring out at the cornfield with a cigarette dangling from his fingers. He wasn't a smoker, at least not that I'd ever seen. "Dad," I said, stepping outside. He didn't look at me. "She's not Emma," he said quietly. I swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" He finally turned to face me, his eyes bloodshot and tired. "You see it too, don't you? The way she looks at us, the way she moves. It's not her." I nodded, my throat tight. He sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "When I was a kid, after Sam disappeared, my parents told me never to talk about it. They said it was better that way, safer." "Safer from what?" I asked. He didn't answer. That night, I heard footsteps outside my window. I peeked through the curtains, my breath fogging the glass. A boy stood in the yard, his face pale and hollow, his eyes like dark pits. He raised a hand and pointed toward the barn, the old horse stable we hadn't used in years. I hesitated, my heart pounding. Then I slipped on my shoes and crept outside. The air was cold, the grass damp beneath my feet. The boy didn't move. He just stood there, pointing. When I reached him, he vanished. I stared at the barn, its wooden doors hanging slightly ajar. A faint light flickered inside, casting long, jagged shadows across the ground. I stepped closer, my hands trembling. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of hay and something else, something metallic and sharp. Hanging from the rafters were scarecrows, dozens of them. Their bodies were stuffed with straw, their limbs stitched together with rough, uneven thread. Each one had a face, some painted, some stitched, some carved into wood. And at the far end of the barn, standing taller than the rest, was the scarecrow from my dreams. Its button eyes seemed to follow me as I stepped inside. Its stitched mouth curled into a grin. "Welcome," a voice whispered. I spun around, but no one was there. The scarecrow's grin widened. I don't remember running back to the house. One minute I was standing in the barn, staring at those twisted scarecrows, and the next I was inside my room, the door locked, my back pressed against the wall. My heart thundered in my chest, my breath coming in sharp, panic gasps. The scarecrow had moved. I swear it had. Its grin had stretched wider, its button eyes gleaming like they were alive, and that voice, soft, mocking, and far too close. Welcome. I couldn't stop shaking. My mind screamed to wake someone up, to tell Dad, tell anyone. But what would I say? That the scarecrows in the barn were watching me, that they were alive. No one would believe me. The next morning, Emma was sitting at the kitchen table when I came downstairs. She was eating cereal, her spoon clinking softly against the bowl. "Morning," she said, her voice light and cheerful. I froze in the doorway. She didn't sound like Emma. Not really. It was too perfect, too practiced, like she was mimicking the way Emma used to speak. "Morning," I mumbled, grabbing a piece of toast and sitting as far from her as I could. She tilted her head, watching me with those empty, unblinking eyes. "You look tired." "I'm fine." Her smile widened. I couldn't eat. Every bite felt like lead in my stomach. Across the table, Emma hummed softly to herself, swinging her legs under the chair. The melody was familiar. "Where did you hear that song?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Emma paused, her spoon halfway to her mouth. "What song?" "The one you were humming." She stared at me, her expression blank. "I don't know. It's just in my head." My hands clenched into fists under the table. It was the same tune I'd heard in my dreams. The soft, eerie melody that always played when the scarecrow appeared. The rest of the day passed in a fog. Mom tried to keep everyone busy, assigning chores and talking about getting back into a routine. But no one could focus. Dad barely spoke. He spent most of the day outside, pacing along the edge of the cornfield. "Leave him be," Mom said when I asked about him. "He's just worried about Emma." But I knew better. He wasn't worried. He was afraid. That night, the whispers came back. At first, I thought it was just the wind. But as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the voices grew louder. "Mira," my heart stopped. "Mira, come outside." I bolted upright, my breath catching in my throat. The voice was faint, distant, but unmistakable. It was Emma's voice. "Mira, please. I need your help." I stumbled to the window, pulling back the curtain. The yard was bathed in moonlight, the cornfield swaying gently in the breeze. And there, standing at the edge of the field, was Emma. I threw on my jacket and ran outside, the cold night air biting at my skin. "Emma," I called, my voice shaking. "What are you doing out here?" She didn't respond. She just stood there, her back to me, her hair blowing softly in the wind. As I got closer, something about her seemed off. Her silhouette was too still, too rigid, like she was frozen in place. "Emma," I whispered, reaching out to touch her shoulder. She turned, and I stumbled back, choking on a scream. It wasn't Emma. Not really. Her face was pale and smooth, her eyes black and empty. Her mouth stretched into an unnatural grin, the corners curling up to her ears. Straw poked out from her sleeves and collar, spilling onto the ground around her feet. "Help me," she whispered, her voice hollow and echoing. I turned and ran, my legs shaking, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Behind me, the whispers grew louder, surrounding me, closing in. "Mira, Mira." I didn't stop running until I was back inside the house, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. For a long time, I just stood there, trembling, trying to catch my breath. "What's wrong?" I jumped, spinning around. Emma was standing at the top of the stairs, her head tilted to one side, her eyes glinting in the dim light. "Nothing," I said quickly. "I thought I heard something outside." She smiled, her teeth gleaming. "It's just the wind." The days blurred together after that. I started seeing things, shadows moving in the corners of my vision, figures standing in the field that vanished when I looked directly at them. At night, the whispers never stopped. Dad grew more distant, spending all his time outside, watching the field. He stopped eating, stopped sleeping. His face grew gaunt, his eyes hollow. Then, one night, he told me the truth. We were sitting on the porch, the air thick with the scent of rain. "Do you know why I told you kids never to go into the field?" he asked, his voice low and rough. I shook my head. "Because it's takes people," he said. "Always has. Always will." He stared out at the corn, his hands trembling. "When I was a boy, my father used to tell me stories about the field," he continued. "He said it was alive, that it could see us, hear us, that it wanted us. I thought he was crazy, until Sam disappeared. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. What happened to him?" Dad's jaw tightened. "The field took him, and when he came back, he wasn't the same." He turned to look at me, his eyes dark and filled with fear. "He don't come back, Mira?" "Not really. Whatever comes out of that field, it's not human." That night, I dreamed of the barn. The scarecrows hung from the rafters, their button eyes glinting in the faint light. The large one, the one from my nightmares, was standing in the center of the room, its grin wider than ever. "Mira," it whispered. I woke up to the sound of knocking. This time, it wasn't coming from the window. It was coming from the door. The knocking didn't stop. Each tap was deliberate, steady, like it was waiting for me to answer. I sat frozen in my bed, staring at the door. My hands gripped the blanket so tightly my knuckles ached. "Mira." The voice was muffled but unmistakable. "Emma's. I need your help," she called. "Please, Mira. I'm scared." It wasn't her. I knew that deep in my bones, the way you know you're falling in a dream and can't stop yourself from hitting the ground. But hearing her voice, so small and trembling, cracked something in me. What if it was her? What if I was wrong? I crept toward the door, my bare feet cold against the wooden floor. The house was silent except for the knocking and the faint creak of the boards beneath me. When I reached the door, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the doorknob, shaking. "Mira, hurry," the voice whispered. "They're coming." My breath hitched. My hand moved on its own, twisting the knob, pulling the door open. The hallway was empty. The knocking started again, this time from downstairs. I followed the sound, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would wake the whole house. The shadows in the hallway stretched unnaturally long, twisting and curling like they were alive. When I reached the kitchen, the back door was wide open. The knocking had stopped. "Mira," the voice called from outside. "Help me." The yard was bathed in moonlight, the cornfield swaying gently in the breeze. And there she was, Emma. She stood at the edge of the field, her hair hanging in tangled strands around her face. Her arms were outstretched, her small hands trembling. "Don't leave me," she sobbed. My feet moved before I could think. I stepped outside, the cool night air stinging my skin. The grass was damp beneath my feet, the ground soft and uneven. "Emma," I called, my voice shaking. "What are you doing out here?" She didn't answer. I kept walking, each step slower than the last. The closer I got, the colder the air felt, the stiller the world became. When I reached her, she turned to face me. It wasn't Emma. Her face was pale, her eyes dark and sunken. Her mouth stretched into that too wide grin, her teeth sharp and gleaming. Straw poked out from her sleeves and collar, spilling onto the ground around her feet. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered, her voice soft and echoing. I stumbled back, my legs trembling. The cornfield behind her began to shift, the stalks parting as if something massive was moving through them. A hand shot out from the corn, pale and bony, grabbing my wrist. "Mira, help me!" I looked down and froze. It was Emma's hand, her real hand. Her face emerged from the corn next, her eyes wide and desperate, her hair tangled with dirt and leaves. "Please," she cried, her voice breaking. "Don't let them take me again." I tried to pull her out, but the straw-stuffed thing that looked like her lunged at me, its grin splitting wider, its hands reaching for my throat. "Stay with us," it hissed. I screamed, wrenching my arm free and stumbling backward. Emma's real hand slipped from mine, and she was dragged back into the corn, her cries swallowed by the rustling stalks. The scarecrow Emma tilted its head, watching me with those black, empty eyes. "You should have stayed inside," it said. Then it turned and walked back into the field, its body jerking unnaturally, the sound of rustling straw following its every movement. I ran back to the house, slamming the door shut behind me. For a long time, I just stood there, trembling, trying to catch my breath. The house felt wrong, too quiet, too still. I crept upstairs, the floorboards creaking under my weight. When I reached Emma's room, I hesitated. The door was ajar. Inside, the bed was empty. The next morning, the police were called. Search parties combed the cornfield again, but just like before, they found nothing. Mom broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. Dad just sat on the porch, staring out at the field, his face pale and drawn. "She's not coming back this time," he whispered, but she did. 2 nights later, there was a knock at the door. Dad answered it, his hands shaking. Emma stood on the porch, her hair neatly combed, her dress clean and unwrinkled. She smiled up at him, her eyes bright and full of warmth. "Hi, Daddy," she said. Dad didn't move. Mom cried, pulling her into a tight embrace. Emma didn't answer. She just smiled. I knew it wasn't her. This new Emma moved differently, spoke differently. Her laugh was too perfect, her smile too wide. She didn't eat, didn't sleep, didn't seem to blink. And at night, I heard her whispering, not to herself, not to us, to the field. The dream started again, more vivid than ever. I saw Emma in the corn, her real face pale and streaked with tears. "Mira," she begged, "help me." I saw the scarecrow, its button eyes glinting, its stitched mouth curling into a grin, and I heard the voice again, "Come back." I couldn't take it anymore. One night, I slipped out of bed, grabbing a flashlight and stepping into the cool night air. The cornfield loomed before me, dark and endless, its stalks whispering softly in the breeze. I hesitated at the edge, my heart racing. Then I heard her, "Mira, please." I plunged into the field, the stalks closing around me like a living thing. The whispers grew louder, the air thick and heavy. "Emma," I called, my voice trembling. Ahead, I saw her real face, her real body, standing in a small clearing. She reached out to me, her eyes wide and pleading. I ran toward her, my breath catching in my throat. But as I reached her, the ground shifted beneath me. Hands shot out from the dirt, pale and skeletal, grabbing at my ankles, my wrists, pulling me down. The scarecrow loomed above us, its button eyes glowing, its stitched mouth curling into a triumphant grin. The last thing I saw was Emma's face, her lips forming a single word, "Run." Then the field swallowed me whole.